I was driving alone on a deserted road, lost in thoughts so fleeting that I barely noticed them as the night fell heavily around me. The boredom of routine and the monotony of the miles passing under the beam of my headlights were for a brief moment forgotten when a flicker of distraction took hold of my mind. In a second that felt eternal, I lost control of the car. I heard the piercing screech of the tires, the deafening crash of the impact, and then a sepulchral silence that engulfed me as darkness consumed my senses. When I regained consciousness, the first sensation that washed over me was a mix of sharp pain and confusion. The car lay wrecked, twisted, and the dimness stretching around me seemed to have swallowed not only the machine, but also time and reality itself. With my mind still foggy and my breathing ragged, I struggled to my feet, leaning against the mangled vehicle, as I tried to make sense of what had happened. The only answer my soul could grasp was an unsettling silence and a feeling of displacement, as if I had crossed an invisible line separating the known world from the unknown. Determined to find help, or at least a sign of life, I stepped away from the wreckage. With each step I took, I felt the strange influence of the environment, as though nature itself whispered secrets long forgotten. The forest before me was dense and impenetrable, its branches reaching out like cold, grasping fingers. As I wandered aimlessly through the darkness, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of my own disturbed imagination, shaken by the accident. But soon I found myself confronted with visions that defied all logic. In the gloom, a ghostly figure emerged as if materializing from the very shadows, a man with wide-mad, terrified eyes and an expression twisted in agony. The image was so vivid that I could almost feel the cold that clung to his desperate stare. I continued walking, clinging to a rationality that the situation clearly refused to allow. With each clearing, each bend in the path, new apparitions surfaced. A woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, drifted slowly from between the trees. Her movements were deliberate and eerie, and for a fleeting moment, her slightly parted lips seemed to form a silent scream. It was as if she were witnessing something utterly horrifying, though nothing stood before her. Only the fall, the impact, the final breath of life. On another occasion, I witnessed a vision so intense it seemed to distort space and time. A young man with a pallid face, arms outstretched as if reaching for something forever lost, reliving in a tormenting loop the moment of his fatal collision. Each encounter tore at me from within. At first, I believed I was merely witnessing echoes of past tragedies, ghosts bound to relive their final moments. But the sheer consistency of these visions refused to let me dismiss them as hallucinations born from trauma. The forest pulsed with its own eerie rhythm, a macabre force that demanded these moments of suffering be eternally reenacted, as if the very earth sought to purge its ancient secrets. I pressed on, sinking deeper into this surreal nightmare, my unease growing with every step, and yet my mind clung to the notion that there had to be an explanation, something tangible, something logical. At times, the discomfort became so overwhelming that I questioned my own sanity. In one such moment, as the branches rustled with whispers of forgotten tales, I stumbled upon a sight that paralyzed me. A man, seemingly caught in an endless cycle of agony, relived his death with an intensity that defied comprehension. Every detail, the tremor of his hands, the vacant, desperate gaze, the precise instant his life slipped away, repeated itself like a never-ending horror film. I stood there, frozen, unable to determine whether what I was seeing was real or the product of a mind fractured by shock and solitude. As time stretched unnaturally, an unsettling sense of déjà vu crept into my thoughts. Yet, my focus remained trapped in these fragmented moments of suffering. I wandered through narrow trails, surrounded by vegetation that seemed to close in around me. The apparitions continued to appear without warning. A woman with terror etched into her face, a young man whose frozen expression pleaded for redemption, and shapeless figures that flickered briefly before dissolving into the darkness. Each encounter was another layer of an unending nightmare, that where time folded upon itself and the final moments of life played on an infinite loop. Despite the growing discomfort and unease, I remained steadfast, believing that somehow I would find a way out of that enigmatic place. Logic insisted that if I kept walking, I would eventually find a sign, a road, or even some form of contact with the world of the living. However, with every step, the landscape became more distorted, and the apparitions grew more persistent. At one moment, I stopped to rest and leaned over a small pool of still water, seeing my distorted reflection on its surface. For a brief instant, I stared into my own eyes, but something in that reflection felt distant, as if a shadow had seeped into my existence. Yet, exhaustion and fear drove me forward, preventing me from dwelling too much on that internal unease. The hours dragged on, and the sense of déjà vu intensified with each new scene unfolding before my eyes. At a certain point, while walking down a narrow trail flanked by twisted trees, a group of figures materialized before me, almost as if they had stepped out of a vivid nightmare. One of them, a man with an anguished expression, relived his final breath with painful precision. I could see the details of his fall, the trembling of his hands, and the sudden shift in his gaze when pain overtook him. Shortly after, a woman appeared, her features contorted in terror as she reenacted the exact moment life abandoned her. These scenes followed one after another, as if the very forest was a canvas where the horrors of the past were projected in real time. I found myself surrounded by these manifestations, each one telling a tragic story, yet I was powerless to intervene or even fully understand them. The atmosphere was thick with an energy I could not decipher, a vibration that seemed to drain the color and warmth from the world around me. The sound of my footsteps against the damp ground was the only reminder that I still existed in this surreal landscape, while the images of death and suffering replayed endlessly, forming a cycle with no apparent end. With each new apparition, a part of me seemed to fade in the effort to understand whether this was a curse, a spell, or merely the echo of an inevitable fate. As the night wore on, the feeling of being pursued by something indescribable intensified. I walked with my heart pounding, senses on high alert, desperately trying to ignore the scenes repeating around me. Yet something seemed to pull me deeper into that macabre cycle, as if the very forest wanted me to stay. Logic told me this was simply the effect of trauma and exhaustion, but the intensity of the visions and the precision of their details defied any simple explanation. As I made my way through trails covered in dry leaves and broken branches, the visions grew increasingly brutal. At one point, I saw an old woman, her eyes fixed on the void, reliving the final seconds of her existence. Her movements were slow, methodical, and her expression of absolute terror was accompanied by a deafening silence. Then, a series of flashes invaded my mind, disfigured faces, screams silenced by time, a succession of deaths playing out without pause. I walked on, consumed by an inexplicable fear, yet with every new apparition, a strange sense of familiarity crept over me, as if I had witnessed all of this before. However, amidst the emotional turmoil, I felt no internal change. I remained myself, though the environment seemed intent on making me doubt my very existence. The discomfort lingered subtly, an unease hidden in the spaces between each scene I witnessed. I struggled to hold on to rationality, telling myself that it was all just hallucinations induced by shock and exhaustion. But the uninterrupted flow of visions, the repetition of final moments, was impossible to ignore. The nature of this place seemed to be a prison of time, where trapped souls were forced to relive their worst moments in an endless cycle. I wandered aimlessly, clinging to the hope that an escape would eventually reveal itself, but with every turn in the path, the specters of death appeared with greater clarity and intensity. The feeling of being drawn toward a terrible fate took hold of me, and even as I tried to rationalize it, the doubt remained. Why was I witnessing this? That question, though it loomed like a silent shadow in my mind, was constantly drowned out by the fear that consumed me. As time seemed to slip away, the environment grew increasingly oppressive. The darkness of the night merged with the density of the trees, creating a scene where the line between reality and illusion completely dissolved. The presence of the entities, so vivid and painful, made the silence of the forest almost deafening. I felt the weight of each story of death, as if every specter carried a truth I could not understand. It was in one of these moments, when my unease reached its peak, that I retraced my steps to the place where the accident had occurred. I arrived at the car, that symbol of an abrupt end, and the familiar sensation of déjà vu struck me with force. Had I done this before? Had I been here already? Why did I feel as if I had seen every one of those souls before? Without a clear reason, I felt an inexplicable force pushing me to step out of the vehicle once again and continue walking along the path that began there. As I did, an eerie sensation washed over me. The environment around me seemed to amplify the sounds and images, as if time itself were compressing into a single cycle of events. And then, suddenly and inevitably, the scene repeated itself with terrifying precision. I relived, in real time, every detail of that fateful moment. The loss of control over the car, the stifled scream of my own anguish, the violent collision, and the impact that hurled me out of the vehicle. It was as if time had folded in on itself, forcing me to experience once more what had already happened, with all the pain and despair that came with it. In that instant, as the sensation of impact and the familiar pain invaded every corner of my perception, a hidden truth revealed itself so subtly that, for a brief moment, I almost didn't grasp it. I was reliving my own death. I was just another soul among the countless ones I had seen here. But the real question now was, for how long? Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more.